Thanks very much, Lee, and hi to everyone as well. And I also wanted to thank ACDI very much for the invitation to speak about my research today. So as Lee mentioned, the topic of my presentation is on effective NDC tracking, looking at a South African case study. And this is research I've been doing for the last couple of years as part of master's work at the University of Cape Town under the supervision of Professor Harold Winkler. Just some context before I get started. Article 13 of the Paris Agreement establishes an enhanced transparency framework for action and support. And this is really an important framework to assess progress toward parties' individual commitments under the Paris Agreement, as well as the collective goals that have been agreed to. And Article 13.7b has a very specific requirement. It asks that all parties regularly provide information necessary to track progress made in implementing and achieving their nationally determined contributions. And the rules to track progress toward NDCs were agreed 2 years ago at COP24 in Katowice. And now with those international rules agreed, it actually becomes important to understand whether NDC tracking can also be useful from a domestic standpoint. So given that we have to do this international requirement, is there ways to make NDC tracking useful? Can it help promote trust and accountability? Can it help inform new policies domestically? And can it further other development priorities? So that's the central research question of my thesis, and that's what I set out to explore. I looked at it in the context of a case study on South Africa, and South Africa was chosen for a few reasons. Firstly, South Africa has had a significant role in the international climate change negotiations, particularly around areas of transparency. South Africa is also actively engaged in multilateral groupings relevant to climate, for example, the African Union, the BASIC grouping, as well as the G77 plus China. South Africa also has nearly a decade of experience in climate change monitoring and evaluation, which actually puts it ahead of developing country peers. And what's shown here on the screen is the evolution of South Africa's monitoring and evaluation system. South Africa formally established its monitoring and evaluation system in national policy back in 2011 and subsequently expanded that framework. It was initially focused on mitigation, and then that framework was expanded to include adaptation and finance in 2015, and it's been operationalized ever since then. South Africa has also had significant experience in reporting on climate change work both internationally and domestically. In 2014, South Africa was one of the first developing country parties to submit its first biennial update report, and it's continued its leadership role up to submitting its third BUR last year and currently developing its fourth biennial update report. And South Africa has also been working on enhancing transparency arrangements domestically through publishing annual climate change reports. And the monitoring and evaluation system is going to be designed in South Africa to continually evolve in response to international reporting requirements, particularly around this enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement. So the first step of this research was to define what is a framework for effective tracking toward nationally determined contributions. What you see on the screen here is somewhat of an adapted logical framework approach. So we're all quite familiar with the logical framework approach. This is this process of a series of nested goals where inputs feed into processes, feed into outputs, feed into outcomes. In the context of the nationally determined contributions, the outcome would obviously be to what extent is the NDC achieved, the outputs being to what extent are the mitigation policies and actions implemented to meet the target. So that is a very typical linear process. It's used around the world for goal tracking, but the problem with this approach is it is linear. And in order to be truly effective, there'd ideally be some kind of elements of circularity where you're continually evaluating the outputs of the M&E system, the outcomes of the M&E system. And you're looking back and seeing if the information that you're collecting to do the NDC tracking is really effective enough and providing the information that you need. So that's this element of circularity. And so this is the framework. And then Importantly, this work needs to be set in the context of an enabling environment. And this is both the enabling environment established internationally under the Paris Agreement, as well as domestically. So if this is really going to succeed, there needs to be high-level political support for climate change action. There needs to be sufficient resources. So there needs to be sufficient financial resources. The team that's charged with undertaking monitoring and evaluation work needs to have enough capacity. And of course, there needs to be trust. There needs to be trust between the people that are providing data to government and government itself. So that's the framework that was established for effective NDC tracking. Now turning to criteria for effective NDC tracking, and this is basically mapping those phases that I've just spoken about: inputs, processes, outputs, outcomes, planning, into criteria to examine whether countries are fully prepared for the NDC tracking. And these criteria were established based on interviews with stakeholders in South Africa, from those that are actually directly working on South Africa's M&E system and government, as well as business, NGOs, and academics. So here's a list of 8 criteria on what would make NDC tracking effective from a domestic point of view. I don't have time to go through it all today, but it is shown here on the screen. I did want to get into results now. So I after having developed this framework and developed the criteria, I applied it to a number of developing country parties, and I wanted to present the results of South Africa here first. So what you see on the right of the screen are these little blobs. If the blob is got a fully colored circle, it means that South Africa is fully meeting this criteria, or at least evidence suggests that they are. If the blob is only partially colored, it means that South Africa is only partially meeting the criteria, and there is probably room for improvement. Again, unfortunately, not enough time to go through all of the results and details, but I'll just pick up on one example here of the importance of establishing the links between climate mitigation efforts and socioeconomic impacts. So this is a deeper examination of this criterion. Evidence would suggest that this criterion is partially met. South Africa has designed its monitoring and evaluation system to produce information of the wider impacts of mitigation actions. Recall that South Africa's climate change policy is embedded within this development context. So the government does intend to collect and report information relevant to the cost efficiency of mitigation actions, the number of jobs created as associated with the mitigation actions. So that intent is there. There is also relevant information. For example, the Department of Planning and Monitoring and Evaluation, thank you, Lee, has examined the socioeconomic impacts of 2 major pieces of South Africa's climate change response. So the information does exist, but South Africa is not currently reporting on the linkages yet. So that's why this criteria is partially met. Again, since I don't have enough time to go through these details, I just wanted to highlight a few of the recommendations for effective NDC tracking, clustered under 3 major buckets in South Africa. Importantly, to improve information collection and reporting systems, demonstrating the links between climate mitigation efforts and positive socioeconomic outcomes. This can be a powerful driver for climate action. And then, of course, make stronger links between the outputs of the NDC tracking work and changes in national policy. Finally, some further research directions. This research did have a fairly narrow scope. It was constrained within the NDCs, very much focused on mitigation, and it was targeted to a small user group within national government. And just wanted to leave a placeholder for further research to explore. One being looking at how this tracking framework could be applied in the context of finance tracking and adaptation tracking, and then also how it could be designed to meet a bigger user group outside of national government. I'll stop there and back to you, Lee. Thank you.